Ma'am, please don't touch that. Olivia Bennett froze in the aisle with one hand halfway toward the tray table in 2A. The passenger beside the window had not raised his voice, but every nearby seat went still. His fingers closed around a worn paper airplane as if it were something alive. Before lifting it, Ethan glanced toward the empty seat beside him. For just a second, he gently straightened the paper airplane as though making sure someone else could still see it. Then he picked it up. Olivia lowered her hand, gave the kind of professional smile flight attendants learn to wear through almost anything, and said, "Of course, sir." The man looked away before she could ask why a folded piece of paper mattered more than the safety card or the landing announcement. 3 hours earlier, Olivia had spotted him before most passengers even reached the air bridge. After years of working flights out of Seattle, Olivia had learned to recognize frequent travelers by their coffee orders, their headphones, even the way they reached for the overhead bins. But this man was different. He appeared once a month, usually on the first weekend of the month, always in seat 2A. The destination changed. Everything else never seemed to. He never used the premium service that surrounded him. He boarded early, placed his bag under the seat instead of overhead, fastened his belt, and turned toward the window as if the rest of the aircraft did not exist. Olivia checked the manifest while the last passengers shuffled aboard. His name was listed as Ethan Carter. Nothing about him matched the relaxed confidence of most business-class passengers. Even his silence seemed practiced, not shy. When Olivia checked the cabin before takeoff, she noticed the paper airplane resting on Ethan's tray table. It was small, creased, and softened at the edges from being handled far too many times. Not a fresh fold from an airport napkin. Not something a child had made while waiting at the gate. This one had history in it. "Sir, would you mind stowing your tray table for takeoff, please?" she said. Ethan did not answer right away. His thumb slid over one wing of the paper airplane, covering whatever was written there. Then, without letting go of it, he folded the tray table up with his free hand. "Sorry," he said. His voice was rough, as though he hadn't spoken much that morning. "No problem." Olivia hesitated for a moment. "Would you like me to place it somewhere safe until we're airborne?" His eyes snapped to hers so quickly she almost stepped back. "No." The single word cut cleanly through the quiet cabin. A passenger across the aisle glanced over. Ethan seemed to realize how sharply it had come out. His grip loosened, but only slightly. "I mean, no, thank you." Olivia nodded and continued her safety check, but the moment stayed with her. During her years as a flight attendant, she had seen passengers protect all kinds of treasured belongings: a faded photograph, a wedding ring, a military medal, even a child's stuffed rabbit too precious to leave in the overhead bin. But he looked afraid of losing that paper airplane. At cruising altitude, Olivia returned with fresh coffee. Ethan still held the paper airplane angled toward the window, as though someone sitting beside him was meant to see the view too. "Fresh coffee?" Olivia asked quietly. "No, thank you." "Water?" Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "Perhaps something to eat?" "I'm fine." His eyes stayed outside. "Just let me know if you need anything." It should have ended there. Then the aircraft lurched unexpectedly. Nothing serious, only a pocket of rough air, but enough to make a few drinks jump. Ethan's hand tightened around the paper airplane so hard one wing bent inward. Olivia instinctively reached toward it. That was when his voice stopped her. "Ma'am, please don't touch that." Now, as the plane began its descent into Denver, Olivia stood beside him with every question caught behind her teeth. Ethan smoothed the damaged wing with 2 fingers, almost apologizing to it. Then, for one brief second, the paper shifted, and Olivia saw thick, uneven letters written in blue crayon across the fold. She only caught 3 words before he covered them again. "Dad, don't fly." Olivia had repeated those 3 words in her head for the rest of the day. "Dad, don't fly." She told herself they could mean anything. A child's game, a family joke, a vacation memory. Yet nothing explained why a grown man protected a paper airplane with more urgency than his own belongings. Nearly a month passed. Another departure out of Seattle. As passengers streamed through the aircraft door, Olivia found herself glancing toward the air bridge before greeting the next traveler. Then she saw him. Ethan Carter stepped aboard at almost the exact minute as before, carrying the same navy bag, wearing another simple jacket, and holding the familiar paper airplane between the pages of a hardcover book. "Good morning," Olivia said. Ethan offered a polite nod. Morning. No smile. No conversation. Just the same seat, 2A. By the time boarding finished, Olivia already knew how the next 2 hours would unfold. Ethan would decline every snack. He would ignore the entertainment screen. Somehow that predictability made him even more mysterious. During cruise altitude, Olivia, anything today? Coffee. Tea. Water, please. It was the first thing he had accepted in months. Olivia handed him the cup. Thanks. You're welcome. She waited half a second, expecting him to add something else. He did not. His attention drifted back toward the window where snow-covered mountains stretched beneath scattered clouds. The paper airplane rested on his knee. Every few minutes his fingers touched one wing, almost without thinking, as though checking it was still there. Month after month, Ethan appeared on another flight departing from Seattle, always during the first weekend of the month. The destination changed. His routine never did. Seat 2A, a polite refusal of lunch. Long stretches of silence. The weathered paper airplane never far from his reach. Yet Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. It wasn't Ethan who had changed. It was the way she had begun to see him. During a layover, she sat in the crew lounge scrolling through news headlines while waiting for transportation to the hotel. Ethan's face appeared unexpectedly in a business magazine article after she typed his name into the search bar. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Carter Biotech. Billion-dollar valuation. Medical. Breakthroughs. National interviews. Philanthropic awards. She looked back at the photograph, then pictured the quiet man she served every month. Someone with resources like his could have chartered a private jet without thinking twice. Yet month after month, he returned to the same ordinary commercial flight with unwavering consistency. Olivia closed the article and stared through the lounge windows toward the runway. She had answered one question, only to uncover a much bigger one. Ethan Carter was exactly the kind of man who never needed to fly commercials. If this wasn't business travel, then what journey was he really taking? A month later, Olivia was assigned to a completely different route. Seeing Ethan Carter again was the last thing she expected. Then the familiar Navy carry-on appeared at the aircraft door. He greeted Olivia with the same quiet nod before taking his seat. Whatever had brought him onto this flight month after month was clearly not something he intended to share. At cruising altitude, Olivia moved quietly through the business class cabin, refreshing coffee cups and offering refills. Water again? She asked with a small smile. Ethan looked up. Yes, thank you. She had just handed him the glass when the aircraft lurched without warning. A sharp jolt ran through the cabin. Several passengers gasped. Olivia instinctively caught herself against the nearest seat. For a split second, Ethan reached for both the glass and the paper airplane. He couldn't save both. Water splashed across the tray table. His attention shifted instinctively toward the cup. The paper airplane slipped from his lap. It floated into the aisle, carried several feet forward by the sudden movement. A chime sounded overhead. The seatbelt sign illuminated. Then the captain's calm voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats immediately and fasten your seatbelts. Olivia reached it before anyone stepped on it. She bent down, picked it up, and turned toward Ethan. I've got it. Before she could hand it back, her eyes caught the writing across one wing. Thick blue crayon, uneven letters that leaned in different directions. There was no mistaking them now. Dad, don't fly without me. Her breath caught. The sentence was so simple that it almost sounded playful, yet something about it landed with unexpected weight. It did not feel like a child's ordinary note. It felt like a promise that had survived long after the child who wrote it had grown silent. Ethan stood just enough to reach across the aisle. Thank you. His voice was steady, but his face was not. His jaw tightened as he accepted the paper airplane, smoothing one bent edge with his thumb before holding it against his chest for a brief second. Olivia wanted to apologize for reading the words, even though it had happened by accident. Instead, she only said, I'm glad it wasn't damaged. Ethan looked down at the faded folds. So am I. He returned to his seat, fastening his belt again as the turbulence faded and the cabin settled. Neither of them spoke for the remainder of the flight. It carried a question neither seemed ready to ask aloud. As passengers stood after landing, Ethan waited until nearly everyone else had left before retrieving his bag. Olivia watched from the forward galley while he paused beside the open aircraft door. For an instant, she thought he might say something. Instead, he slipped the paper airplane back inside his book. When he lifted his head, Olivia saw the mask slip. The grief Ethan had carried so carefully through every flight finally reached his eyes. By the time Autumn reached Seattle, seeing Ethan once a month no longer felt like coincidence. Then, for the first time, the flight itself refused to leave on time. The aircraft door remained open several minutes longer than scheduled while the gate agent spoke with the captain outside. Passengers exchanged impatient looks. A few checked their watches. Others sighed as phones came back out. Then the announcement arrived. Ladies and gentlemen, we're waiting for updated departure paperwork. It should only take a few minutes. Thank you for your patience. The engines remained quiet. No one could go anywhere yet. Olivia completed the final cabin check and found herself standing near seat 2A. Ethan looked up from the paper, airplane resting in his hands. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence felt different now, less guarded. Looks like we're staying on the ground a little longer, Olivia said. Ethan glanced toward the window. That doesn't happen often. Long delays are rare. A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing again. Olivia hesitated. Professional boundaries still mattered, but months of unanswered questions had settled between them. She nodded toward the folded paper. Did your son make it? Ethan lowered his eyes to the airplane. His thumb traced one worn crease. Several seconds passed before he answered. Yes. His voice carried no hesitation this time. He folded dozens of them. Olivia smiled. He must have been pretty good at it. Eventually, a quiet breath escaped him. The first ones barely looked like airplanes. Kids usually improve fast. He practiced until every wing matched. Ethan studied the paper as though seeing another pair of hands holding it. He hated crooked folds. Olivia laughed softly. Sounds like he had high standards. He did. For the first time since she had met him, Ethan's expression warmed with a genuine memory instead of distant restraint. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it transformed his entire face. Olivia realized she had never actually seen what he looked like when he remembered something happy. The gate agent finally stepped aboard and signaled the captain with a thumbs up. Boarding paperwork had been cleared. The cabin door closed, and the familiar safety routine resumed. During takeoff, Olivia found herself thinking less about the mystery and more about the little boy she had never met. A child patient enough to keep folding paper airplanes until every wing lined up perfectly. Someone who had written those uneven blue words because, at the time, they probably seemed completely ordinary. The flight itself passed much like every other month. Ethan declined lunch. He watched the landscape below. He thanked Olivia when she refilled his water. There was no dramatic conversation, no unexpected confession. Yet something invisible had shifted. They no longer felt like strangers sharing an aisle. They were two people, carrying different pieces of the same unfinished story. After landing, passengers filed toward the exit. Ethan remained seated until the aisle cleared, as he always did. Olivia waited near the aircraft door, greeting travelers one by one. When Ethan reached her, he adjusted the strap of his carry-on and looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For asking about him." Olivia gave a small nod. "I'm glad you told me." Ethan looked down the empty jet bridge before answering. "I only fly once a month now." He offered nothing more. No explanation. No reason. Then he walked away, disappearing into the terminal before Olivia could respond. She remained at the doorway long after the last passenger had left. His words echoed louder than they should have. He had not said he traveled every month because of business. He had not said he enjoyed this route. He had said, "I only fly once a month now," which meant there had been a time when he flew far more often. Something had changed so completely that a man who once lived in airports had reduced his entire world to a single monthly flight. Olivia watched the empty air bridge, unable to shake the feeling that the answer had nothing to do with airplanes at all. The sentence stayed with Olivia for weeks. "I only fly once a month now." It sounded less like a travel schedule and more like the ending of a life she could not see. During her next overnight layover, she found herself sitting alone in the hotel lobby with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. She opened her laptop and typed Ethan Carter's name again. This time she looked beyond the business headlines. Interviews, podcasts, charity events, magazine profiles. There were hundreds of results stretching back more than a decade. The younger Ethan smiled easily. Reporters described him as relentless, always catching another flight, another meeting, another conference. More than one interviewer joked that airports were practically his second home. Olivia clicked on an older television interview recorded several years earlier. The host asked what success meant to him after Carter Biotech reached another major milestone. Ethan laughed instead of talking. About profits. Honestly, he said, my favorite title isn't CEO. It's Dad. The screen cut to a photograph of a little boy with bright eyes sitting on Ethan's shoulders at what looked like an air show. That's Noah, Ethan continued. He thinks every airplane is the coolest thing ever made. The audience laughed with him. Ethan did too. Olivia paused the video. She barely recognized the man from seat 2A. The smile was wider. His voice carried energy instead of exhaustion. His eyes were lighter somehow. She kept watching. In another interview, Noah proudly showed off a paper airplane he had folded while sitting beside his father. The host tossed it across the studio, and Noah burst into laughter when it sailed farther than anyone expected. Ethan clapped harder than anyone else. Olivia smiled without realizing it. Then she noticed something else. The interviews stopped mentioning Noah. Not gradually. Completely. One year he appeared everywhere beside his father. The next, he was gone. Olivia searched for more recent family photographs. None. Charity galas showed Ethan attending alone. Company celebrations featured executives, investors, and researchers, but no child. Even magazine profiles describing his personal life skipped over family entirely. It was as though someone had quietly erased Noah from every public story after a certain point. Olivia tried searching Noah Carter directly. The results were surprisingly few. Old photographs, a school fundraiser, a youth aviation event, then nothing. No graduation pictures, no sports teams, no social media updates shared by Ethan. Nothing that explained the sudden silence. She closed her laptop for a moment and stared through the hotel window. She had expected to uncover a divorce, a custody dispute, or perhaps a deliberate choice to keep a child away from public attention. Instead, she had found an empty space that no article wanted to explain. When Flight 418 began boarding again, Olivia recognized him long before the boarding scanner announced his name. Same window seat, same paper airplane. As Olivia welcomed him aboard, she noticed something she had somehow missed before. He paused for the briefest moment at the aircraft door and looked toward the cabin with an expression that was almost familiar, as though stepping inside this airplane meant returning somewhere he refused to forget. He nodded politely and continued to seat 2A. Throughout the flight, Olivia said nothing about the interviews. She asked only if he wanted water. He thanked her with the same restrained smile she had begun to recognize. The questions could wait. Whatever had happened to Noah did not belong in the middle of beverage service. Still, after the aircraft reached Denver and the cabin emptied, Olivia compared the dates she had seen online with the flight records she remembered from crew schedules. A chill ran through her. Olivia pulled up several old crew schedules. At first, the destinations looked completely unrelated. Phoenix, Chicago, San Diego, Denver, Boston. Yet one detail never changed. Every trip departed from Seattle on the first weekend of the month. Every reservation was for seat 2A. A month passed. Saturday brought Ethan back into Olivia's cabin once again. This time, however, he didn't simply offer his usual quiet smile. He paused at the boarding door. "Do you have a minute after takeoff?" he asked. Olivia looked at him, surprised. "I think so." He nodded. "I'd like to explain something." "All right." 2 hours later, the cabin settled into one of those rare stretches of complete quiet. Most passengers were reading or sleeping. Olivia finished collecting empty cups and walked towards seat 2A. Ethan looked at the empty seat beside him. "No one's there if you'd like to sit for a moment." She checked the cabin one more time before taking the aisle seat across from him. Neither of them spoke immediately. Ethan turned the paper airplane over in his hands, studying its faded folds. "You looked it up, didn't you?" Olivia hesitated before answering. "I did." He nodded. "I figured you might." There was no irritation in his voice, only acceptance. "You probably noticed my son disappeared from every interview." Olivia answered quietly. "Yes." Ethan rested the paper airplane on the tray table between them. Noah was 8. The sentence lingered in the air. He was diagnosed with leukemia. Olivia felt her chest tighten, but said nothing. Ethan continued at his own pace. Treatment lasted almost 2 years. Some weeks were encouraging, others weren't. Hospitals become strange places after a while. You stop counting days and start counting good afternoons. A faint smile crossed his face. One afternoon, Noah asked if we could build paper airplanes instead of playing video games. He decided each airplane needed a message before we folded it. Ethan unfolded one corner just enough for Olivia to see the blue crayon without exposing the entire note. Most of them were funny. "Dad, your folding is terrible. This one flies better than yours." Things like that. His smile faded naturally, replaced by quiet reflection. Toward the end, he wrote different messages. Olivia looked at the paper airplane but kept her eyes from lingering on the words. Ethan noticed anyway. "You already saw this one." She nodded once. "Dad, don't fly without me." Ethan drew a slow breath. People hear that sentence and assume he was afraid of airplanes. He shook his head. He loved airplanes. He could identify almost every commercial jet by its engines before he was 7. He looked through the window where another aircraft crossed the distant sky. What he was afraid of was watching me leave again. Olivia remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Back then I traveled constantly. Investor meetings, research conferences, international partnerships. I convinced myself I was building something that would give Noah a better future." His eyes never left the clouds. Every few moments, his thumb unconsciously smoothed one worn crease along the paper airplane's wing, as though afraid time itself might erase it. One evening, I told him I'd be gone for 3 days. Ethan's voice softened. He folded this airplane while I packed my suitcase. He touched the blue letters with one finger. "Dad, don't fly without me." The cabin around them seemed to disappear. Olivia understood the sentence completely now. It had never been about boarding an airplane together. It had been a little boy asking his father to stay beside him while he still could. Ethan swallowed before continuing. "I canceled that trip." He paused. "Then I canceled the next one. And the one after that." He gave a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "Eventually I canceled everything." His hand closed around the paper airplane. But I was already too late. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan looked back at Olivia. "People think grief arrives all at once. Mine didn't. It showed up every time I walked past an airport, every time I saw a boarding pass, every time I realized the calendar kept moving without him." He glanced toward the window seat where Noah had once sat. "So I made myself one promise." Olivia waited. "When Noah was little, weekends belonged to us. Summer trips, long weekends, school breaks. He kept a map on his bedroom wall. Every place we visited together got another pin. We always talked about filling the entire map someday. We never did. After he was gone, I couldn't even look at that map. A year later, I took one flight. The next month, another. Now I visit one place every month. One destination we never reached together. I spent years believing I was giving Noah everything he needed. The best doctors, best hospitals. Every treatment money could buy. What I couldn't give him was another Saturday with his father. Neither of them moved for several moments after Ethan finished speaking. The engines hummed beneath the cabin floor while sunlight drifted across the window. Olivia searched for something comforting to say, but every familiar phrase felt too small. "I'm sorry" could never carry the weight of what he had lived through. Instead, she asked the only question that seemed to matter. What was Noah like when he wasn't in the hospital? Ethan smiled before answering. This time the smile stayed. Curious about everything. He'd ask pilots how wings worked, then ask mechanics why tires didn't explode on landing. If someone gave him 5 minutes, he'd turn it into 20 questions. Olivia sounds like a kid I'd remember. Most people did. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a worn leather wallet. From a hidden sleeve, Ethan slid out a small photograph with softened corners. This was one of his favorite days, he said. He handed it to Olivia. She accepted it carefully. The photograph showed a young Noah sitting by the airplane window, his cheeks slightly flushed, but his smile unmistakably bright. A small pair of silver junior pilot wings was pinned proudly to the front of his shirt. Beside him, a younger Olivia knelt in the aisle in her flight attendant uniform, smiling as Noah beamed at the camera. Olivia stared at the photograph. Then her eyes settled on the tiny silver wings. Her breath caught. Those wings. Ethan looked at her in surprise. "You remember them?" Olivia nodded slowly. "I gave them to him." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then another memory quietly returned. "He had a fever that day," Olivia said softly. Nothing serious at first, but he looked so disappointed. He thought getting sick had ruined your trip. A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. He wouldn't stop talking about airplanes. Olivia smiled too. He told me he wanted to become a pilot. She looked back at the photograph. Before we landed, I brought him a pair of junior pilot wings. I've handed out hundreds of them over the years. Her voice caught, but I never forgot his smile. Ethan lowered his eyes to the picture. He didn't either. A quiet laugh escaped him. He wore those wings almost every day until they finally fell apart. At the time, she had thought it was only a kind moment shared with a sick little boy on a difficult flight. She had never imagined it was the beginning of something much larger. Ethan drew a slow breath. A few weeks later, everything changed, he said. The fever came back, then the bruises, then the tests. Olivia lowered the photograph slightly. Leukemia, he said. The words settled between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Olivia looked down at the faded photograph. Ethan took the photograph back carefully, but he did not put it away immediately. Olivia looked toward the paper airplane resting in Ethan's hands. She had walked away from moments believing they were small acts of kindness. She had never realized she had become part of Noah's happiest memories. The captain announced the initial descent, and passengers began raising their window shades. Olivia stood slowly, smoothing her uniform before returning to work. Ethan folded the paper airplane into his hands once more, but this time the silence between them no longer carried unanswered questions. It carried someone they had both known in different ways. As Olivia started toward the galley, Ethan called after her. He would have been happy you remembered him. She turned back with a warm, tearful smile. I don't think I ever forgot him, she said. I just didn't know his name. Over the following weeks, something subtle began to change. The route no longer surprised Olivia. What surprised her was how different Ethan seemed each time he stepped aboard. He still chose seat 2A or carried Noah's paper airplane inside the familiar hardcover book. But Olivia noticed one difference almost immediately. He no longer spent the entire flight staring out the window. Sometimes he looked up when she walked by. Sometimes they spoke for a minute or two about ordinary things. The weather in Seattle, a delayed departure, a baseball score scrolling across the airport television. They never forced the conversations. They simply happened. One month, Olivia brought him a fresh cup of coffee before he asked. Ethan smiled. You're starting to remember my routine. You've made it easy, she replied. You haven't changed it in months. He looked down at the paper airplane resting beside the cup. Maybe it's time part of it did. The sentence stayed with Olivia long after the flight landed. A few days later, she received an email from Ethan. It was brief. He thanked her for listening and asked if she would be willing to meet for lunch during her next layover in Seattle. They chose a quiet cafe near the waterfront. Ethan arrived carrying no briefcase, no laptop, only the familiar book tucked under one arm. As they talked, he admitted something he had never said aloud before. I've spent years protecting Noah's memory, he said. I'm not sure I've actually been sharing it. Olivia stirred her tea for a moment before answering. Those aren't always the same thing. Ethan looked at her, waiting. When someone you love is gone, she said, quietly, it's easy for their illness to become the whole story, but it never really is. He remained silent. From everything you've told me, and from the little boy I met on that flight, Noah was curious. Funny, he made games out of ordinary moments. That's how people should remember him. A slow smile returned to Ethan's face. I haven't told those stories in a long time. Then maybe someone else needs to hear them. Several weeks later, Olivia received another message. This time it wasn't a question, but an invitation. Carter Biotech had partnered with Seattle Children's Hospital to sponsor an aviation day for young patients and their families, a program Ethan hoped would celebrate curiosity instead of illness. Pilots volunteered to speak with the children. Engineers brought portable flight simulators. Local artists filled long tables with colored paper, markers, and craft supplies. At the bottom of the invitation, Ethan had added a handwritten note. I think Noah would have loved this. On the morning of the event, laughter filled the activity room long before the program officially began. Sheets of colored paper covered every table. Children experimented with impossible airplane designs while parents forgot, if only for an afternoon, the worries waiting beyond the hospital doors. Olivia stood beside a group of volunteers demonstrating different folding techniques when she noticed Ethan across the room. A little girl held up an uneven paper airplane and asked, "Do you think this one can really fly?" Ethan accepted it with complete seriousness. There's only one way to find out. Together, they launched it across the room. It dipped sharply, bounced off a chair, and landed upside down. The little girl burst into laughter. So did Ethan. The sound reached Olivia before he even realized he was laughing. It was open, unguarded, and wonderfully familiar. Not because she had heard it before, but because it matched the joyful father she had seen years earlier in those old interviews. As the afternoon came to an end, dozens of paper airplanes hung from strings stretched across the ceiling, each carrying a handwritten wish from a child. Ethan looked upward, taking them in. One by one, he reached into his book, removed Noah's weathered airplane, and held it beside the colorful new creations. For the first time since Olivia had known him, the paper airplane no longer felt like the last thing he had left of Noah. It felt like the beginning of something Noah had quietly left behind. Around it, dozens of children's airplanes swayed gently from the ceiling, carrying hopes, dreams, and impossible destinations. Ethan smiled. Noah's story had finally become larger than his loss. Nearly a year passed before Olivia realized she had stopped waiting for Thursdays with the same quiet curiosity that had once defined them. Ethan still appeared from time to time, though not every month anymore. Sometimes work took him elsewhere. Sometimes he sent a short email instead, sharing a photograph from another children's aviation day or a paper airplane folded by a young patient who insisted it could fly all the way to the moon. Each message carried a different story. Every one of them carried Noah's spirit. On a cool autumn morning, Olivia reported for another Seattle to Denver flight. The boarding process began as usual. Families searched for their seat numbers. Business travelers balanced coffee cups and laptops. A young boy proudly showed his mother a paper airplane he had folded while waiting at the gate. Olivia smiled without thinking. When boarding was nearly complete, her eyes drifted towards seat 2A. The seat remained empty. She checked the passenger list once, then again. Ethan Carter was not on it. A strange feeling settled over her. For months, that seat had become a quiet reminder that love could survive unimaginable loss. Seeing it empty felt like reaching the final page of a book she had never wanted to end. Just before the aircraft door closed, the gate agent stepped aboard. "Olivia." "Yes. Someone asked me to give this to you." She accepted a small cream-colored envelope with her name written neatly across the front. There was no return address. She already knew who had sent it. After the aircraft reached cruising altitude and another flight attendant covered the aisle for a few minutes, Olivia opened the envelope. Inside rested the weathered paper airplane. The faded blue crayon was still visible across one wing. Beneath it lay a folded note. She unfolded it slowly. "Olivia, for years I believed carrying this airplane was the only way to keep Noah close. You reminded me that memories were never meant to stay folded forever. They are meant to be shared. I finally learned how to fly forward. Thank you for helping me carry him until I could. Ethan." Olivia read the note twice before carefully placing it back inside the envelope. She unfolded the paper airplane just enough to smooth one small crease that had formed over the years, then folded it again exactly the way Noah had left it. Instead of returning it to the envelope, she slipped it into the inside pocket of her flight manual. It would travel with her now, not as a burden, but as a promise. Later that afternoon, while passengers stepped into the terminal, a little boy paused beside the aircraft door, holding a bright green paper airplane. "Do you think this one flies okay?" he asked. Olivia accepted it with a grin. "Let's see." She gave it a gentle toss down the empty aisle. The airplane glided in a long, graceful arc before settling softly onto a seat several rows away. The boy clapped with delight and ran to retrieve it before hurrying after his family. Olivia watched him disappear into the jet bridge, smiling to herself. She looked through the cabin windows as the morning sun reflected across the wing. A year earlier, she had believed the same quiet passenger kept returning because he could not escape his past. Now she understood the truth. He had returned until he found someone willing to remember Noah with him. Once that memory belonged to more than one heart, he no longer needed the same seat or the same monthly journey. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Olivia rested a hand on the flight manual tucked beneath her arm. Somewhere above the clouds, countless paper airplanes existed only for a few seconds before drifting back to Earth. Their flight was always brief. The love that launched them never was.